In this video we're going to be looking at assigning access to one of your views, whether it's an analytic view, a calculation view or an attribute view. In this example I'm going to be using an attribute view. So to do this we need to launch our SAP HANA Studio, so I go to Start, All Programs, SAP HANA, and I launch the SAP HANA Studio. So in our database we already have a schema called STS, and within that schema I've got a singular table called dim customer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a attribute view and then give access to the attribute view. One thing of note is that to do this you must have the modular perspective selected. If you're not sure, click on the icon to the left of the perspective, which is open perspective. Click on Other and just double click on Modeler. That will open the modular perspective. Now because we're dealing with these views, whether they're analytic, attribute or calculation views, we needed to run a specific command to allow our system administrator to administrate this STS schema. To do this, select your system database and select the SQL editor, which is the blue icon with the white writing. This is an example of the command. So it's grant select on the schema. So the schema we want to use is STS. And we want to allocate this to the user who's administrating, which is the sys_repo user. So I'm going to execute that. And the grant option is given. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and we can look at creating our view within our content folder. So I'll just close this window. So to do this, we need to first build our attribute view. So you do this in the content folder, and we first need a package. This is quite important. So I'm going to create a package called STS and click OK. And then I'm going to create an attribute view within that package. So the key thing is that we've created a package which the attribute view goes in. So I'm going to call this STS @_view. So it's an STS attribute view. I'll click Next. I'll add the singular table that we've got. Then I'll click on Finish. So an attribute view, as we know, can only contain dimensions. It doesn't really contain measures or calculations. So I'm just going to add to this view company name, city name, country and region. I'll select those columns, right click, and I'll say Add as Attribute. And then of course we need our key attribute, so I'm going to go ahead and add the customer ID as my primary key or key attribute. You can see that indicated here with the green star. So now that I've done that, I'm going to execute. And you might get a message that you've got an inactive version of the object which doesn't exist. That's fine, it's just because we haven't saved the attribute view yet. So just click on Yes. And there we were able to deploy successfully. So the next step is to simply create an analytic privilege which gives access to this view. With an analytic privilege we can then secure access to the rows or the columns within that data set. So to do this we right click on STS and we say New Analytic Privilege. I'm going to call this STS_AP. Click on Description, then click on Next. We need to choose the attribute view that we want to allocate the security to. So for us it's the STS ATT view. Then click Finish. So this is all we have to do here. If we wanted to restrict the columns or the rows, we would change our restrictions or our attribute restrictions. But for us we don't need to do that. So now we can just click on the right hand side, Save and Activate. So now if I expand the STS package, we've got the analytic view that we built called STS ATT view, and the analytic privilege that we've just built called STS_AP. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and create our user. So we build our users in the catalog folder, within authorization folder, and within the users subcategory. So just before I do, I'm going to close this analytic privilege. We don't need it anymore. I'm going to close the attribute view, and we also don't need quick launch. So I'm going to right click on the users and select new user. We're going to call this one STS_ATT_read, because it's going to be someone who only has select privileges on that attribute view. And we'll just give a default password, which we will be expected to change in a few minutes. So I'm going to call this capital S lowercase ts 12345. And let's just actualize that or deploy that just so we can save that user. Great. So now we have to allocate the access. So I'm just going to close this job log and the where use list as well. So in terms of the granted role, well, it's fine to leave the public role. In another video, we're going to look at creating roles so we can assign users to roles rather than privileges to specific users. In terms of SQL privileges, well, we're going to need access firstly to the view. So if I click on the green plus under SQL privilege and do a search for STS, and then we're going to select the fourth option, which is the STS attribute view. So then I'll click on OK, and the only access we need to give here is select access. So I'm going to click on select and then click on deploy just to save that. So now that we've saved that, we can go and add our analytic privilege. So in the third tab, we can go and again click on the green plus button, do a search for STS, and we're going to add this STS ATT AP, which is the analytic privilege that we built before. We don't need to add any system privileges, and in terms of packet privileges, we need to go and add access to the package, because if you can't see the package, you won't be able to see any views which are contained in the package. The only thing we need to give here is repo read as access. So just to confirm, we've got the public role, which is automatically granted. We've allocated the attribute view. We've allocated the analytic privilege, and we've allocated the correct package. So now all we need to do is deploy that, and there we go, we've modified that user. So now what we need to do is test whether or not it works. So the simplest thing to do here is create another system. Now this is a great test because this will make sure that we've added all the correct rights, just in case we've forgotten any privileges to add. So to do this, I'm going to right click and say add a new system. It's the same host, it's the same instance, which is 00, and I'm going to call this test because we're just using this for testing purposes. Now we need to enter that new user. So the user was called STS_ATT_read, and the password, which will be expected to change, is capital S lowercase ts 12345. Then I'll click on next and finish. So we're asked to change the password, so I'm going to change it simply to capital S lowercase AP 12345. And click on OK. So now we've got this new system that we can use to test access. You should always do this before you actually send the user out, because again, you might have forgotten to add specific privileges. So if I refresh this content folder and expand it, we can see that we've got an error. So this is because we don't have sufficient privileges to execute on our repository REST, which is a specific part of the repository. So quite simply, there are a few more permissions that we need to generically add all the time. So the first one is if I go, oops, it's not a privilege, it's not a package privilege, it's a SQL privilege. We need to add 3 more privileges. One of them is access to what's called the repository REST, which is a specific part of our repository, and we need execute access to that repository REST. Additionally, because the objects are saved in the sysbic schema and some parts are saved in the sysbi schema, it's also a good idea to give access to both sysbi and the sysbic schemas. Again, we need to give execute and select access on both the sysbi and the sysbic schemas generically. So these 3 rights you need to apply most of the time when you're creating this access. So again, I'll deploy, and now I will expand the catalog, the refresh on the content folder. So now we have access to the package. If I expand STS, we can see we've got the view, and if I right click on the view and say data preview, we have access to the data. But then the question is, are we able to create more views? Are we able to do stuff? Well, if I close the view and close the privilege, if I right click on the attribute view and select new, we are not allowed to create any additional packages because we don't have access. Again, if I try and create a new analytic privilege, we've got the same error message. If I go now into right click on the view and try and delete it and click on yes, you see it completes with errors because I'm not actually able to delete the view. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but there's a lot of things we can't do. So we can really only access the data within this view. We can't delete it, we can't add extra views, and we can't modify the data in the view because of course it's a view and it's not a physical table. Notice that we didn't give access to the STS schema, so if I go into the catalog folder for this user, there is no access to the STS schema. So they can't actually create any new tables within those schemas as well. So that's a simple way in which you can give read-only access to specific users who you want to only be able to read data within any of the views. In this case, it was an attribute view within the SAP HANA Studio.